I'm Etzion for Haifa, Israel, to the 27th of September 2025. As usual, we start our recording with a musical piece. And later on, we'll continue to discuss the nature of the ego and its termination, the key, most important discourses of Meher Baba, to my understanding. That was an Israeli tune, a nice piece. We witnessed dozens of individuals, all of them have egos, including myself, and we managed to work together as one body under the directive of our beloved dictator. And this is simile to the what we should have created on earth as spiritual circles. Spiritual circles, of course, are in much higher state than a musical band. Okay, now we continue with the reading of Baba's discourses on the ego. In 11 pages, There is such a supreme wisdom to change. Got a message from our Michal just now. She came back from Meher Baba. Put some fragrance to this tone about the situation from Meher Baba a little bit. All of us hoping that one day humanity will figure out what is the nature of the ego and its termination. This actually is the crux of the issue, what's going on in the world. That's the whole point. The ego is an affirmation of separateness. It takes many forms. It may take the form of a continued self-conscious memory expressing itself in recollections. Like, I did this and I did that. I felt this and I felt that. I thought this and I thought that. It also takes the form of ego-centered hopes for the future expressing themselves through plans. Like, I shall do this and I shall do that. I shall feel this and I shall feel that. I shall think this, I shall think that. Or again, in the present, the ego manifests itself, a strong feeling of being someone particular and assert its distinctness and separateness from all other centers of consciousness, while provisionally serving a useful purpose as a center of consciousness. The ego, an affirmation of separateness, constitutes the chief hindrance to spiritual emancipation, enlightenment of consciousness. The ego affirms its separateness through craving, hate, anger, fear, or jealousy. When a person craves the company of others, he is keenly conscious of being separate from them and thus feels his own separate existence intensely. The feeling of separation from others is most acute where there is great and unrelieved craving. In hate and anger also, the other person is, so to speak, thrown out of one's own being and regarded not only as a foreigner, but as a definitely hostile to the thriving of one's ego. Fear also is a subtle form of affirming separateness and exists through the consciousness of duality is unabated. Fear acts as a thick curtain between the I and the you, and it not only nourishes deep distrust of the other, but inevitably brings about a shrinking and withdrawal of consciousness, so as to exclude the being of another from the context of one's own life. Therefore, not only other souls, but God should be loved and not feared. To fear God or his manifestation is to strengthen duality. To love God and his manifestations is to weaken it. And most of religions are being mistaken about this. Fear God. This is a wrong interpretation of what's written in the Torah of Master Moses. In Hebrew, the expression Yareh Elohim, Yareh is to see God, and Yareh is also to fear. You can try, Hebrew is like a double-edged sword. All these translations to fear God because it's a misinterpretation of the word Yareh. Yareh is from the I, Ani Oe. This is Hebrew. Still was written like this expression 3,000 years ago by Yareh. I see God. What there is to be afraid of God? He's about. He has laws. He is teaching us how not to get involved with troubles. Then we get afraid because when we get involved with troubles, there are repercussions like by the law of karma. Then we think like The ancients thought that God is getting angry at us. Hopefully we're a little bit more mature, but it doesn't look like. The feeling of separateness finds most poignant expression in jealousy. There is a deep and imperative need in the human soul to love and identify itself with other souls. This is not fulfilled in any instance, whether there is craving or hate, anger or fear. In jealousy, in addition to the non-fulfillment of this deep and imperative need for identification with other persons, there is a belief that some other soul has successfully identified itself with the person whom one sought. This creates a standing and irreconcilable protest against both individuals for developing relationship that one really wished to reserve for oneself. All exclusive feelings like craving, hate, fear, or jealousy bring about a narrowing down of life and contribute to the limitation and restriction of consciousness. They become directly instrumental in the affirmation of separateness of the ego. Every thought, feeling, or action that springs from the idea of exclusive or separate existence binds. All experiences, small or great, and all aspirations, good or bad, create a load of impressions and nourish the sense of the I. The only experience that makes for the slimming down of the ego is the experience of love. The only aspiration that makes for the alleviation of separateness is the longing to become one with the beloved. Craving, hatred, anger, fear, and jealousy are all exclusive attitudes that create a gulf between oneself and the rest of life. Love alone is an inclusive attitude which helps bridge this artificial and self-created gulf, attempts to break through the separative barrier of false imagination. In true love, the lover also longs, but he longs for union with the beloved. When seeking or experiencing union with the beloved, the sense of the I becomes feeble. In love, the I does not think of self-preservation, just as the moth is unafraid of getting burned in the flame. The ego is the affirmation of being separate from the other, while love is the affirmation of being one with the other. And the ego can be dissolved only through real love. The ego is implemented by desires of varied types. Failure to fulfill desires is a failure of the ego. Success in attaining desired object is success of the ego. Through fulfilled desires as well as through unfulfilled ones, the ego is accentuated. The ego can even feed upon a comparative lull in the surging of desires and assert its separative tendencies through feeling that it is desireless. When there is a real cessation of all desires, however, there is cessation of the desire to assert separativeness in any form. Therefore, real freedom from all desires brings about the end of the ego. The ego is made of variegated desires. The destroying of these desires now amounts to the destruction of the ego. The problem of erasing the ego from consciousness is very complicated, however, because the roots of the ego are all in the subconscious mind in the form of latent tendencies. And these latent tendencies are not always accessible to explicit consciousness. The limited ego of explicit consciousness is only a small fragment of the total ego. The ego is like an iceberg floating in the sea. About 1/7 of the iceberg remains above, surface of the water and is visible to the onlooker, but the major portion remains submerged and invisible. The same way, only a small portion of the real ego becomes manifest in consciousness in the form of an explicit I. The major portion of the real ego remains submerged in the dark, inarticulate sanctuaries of the subconscious mind. The explicit ego, which finds its manifestation in consciousness, is by no means a harmonious whole. It can and does become an arena for multitudinous conflicts between opposing tendencies. It has a limited capacity, however, for allowing simultaneous emergence of conflicting tendencies. Two persons have to be at least on speaking terms if they are to enter into articulate wrangling. If they are not on speaking terms, they cannot bring themselves to quarrel on common ground. In the same manner, two tendencies that can enter into conscious conflict must have some common ground. If they are too disparate, they cannot find admittance into the arena of consciousness, even as conflicting tendencies. They have to remain submerged in the subconscious mind until they are both modified through the tension exerted by the diverse activities connected with the conscious mind. Although the entire ego is essentially heterogeneous in its constitution, the explicit ego of consciousness is less heterogeneous than the implicit ego of the subconscious mind. The explicit ego operates as a formidable whole compared with the isolated subconscious tendencies that seek to emerge in consciousness. The organized ego of explicit consciousness thus becomes a oppressive barrier that indefinitely prevents several constituents of the implicit ego from access to consciousness. While the problems of the ego can be tackled only through intelligent and conscious action. Therefore, complete annihilation of the ego is possible only when all the constituents of the ego pass through the fire of intelligent consciousness. The action of intelligent consciousness on the components of the explicit ego is important, but in itself it is not sufficient for the desired results. The components of the implicit ego of the subconscious mind have to be brought to the surface of consciousness somehow and become parts of the explicit ego and then be submitted to the action of intelligent consciousness. This is to be achieved. There has to be a weakening of the explicit ego in such manner as to allow the emergence into consciousness of thoughts, desires, and tendencies that could not hitherto find admittance into the arena of consciousness. This release of inhibited tendencies naturally brings about additional confusion and conflict in the explicit ego. Therefore, disappearance of the ego is often accompanied by intensified conflicts in the arena of the conscious mind rather than by any comfortable easing of them. However, at the end of the uncompromising and acute struggle lies a state of true poise and unassailable harmony that comes after the melting away of the entire iceberg of the ego. Quite a long discourse. It was for just a minute. You have sent me a notice. Let me just respond to this. Okay, continue. Oh, Michal just came from Meher Baba yesterday. Sent me a few messages. You know, Michal Sivan Namu is helping often with, the artists and others. The digging out of the bird roots of the ego from the deeper layers of the subconscious and bringing them to the light of consciousness is one important part of the process of wiping out the ego. The other important part consists in the intelligent handling of desires after they gain entrance to the arena of consciousness. The process of dealing with the components of explicit consciousness is by no means clear and simple, for the explicit ego has a tendency to live through any one of the opposites of experience. If it is ousted from one opposite by the intensive operation of intelligent consciousness, it has a tendency to move to the other extreme and live through it. Through repeated alternation between the opposites of experience, the ego eludes the attack of intelligent consciousness and seeks to perpetuate itself. The ego is hydra-headed and expresses itself in numberless ways. It lives upon any type of ignorance. Pride is a specific feeling through which egoism manifests. A person can be proud of the most unimportant and silly things. Instances are known, for example, people developing their nails to an abnormal length and preserving them, despite much inconvenience to themselves, for no other reason than to assert separateness from others. The ego must magnify its attainments in grotesque ways if it is to live in them. Direct assertion of the ego through self-display in society is very common. But if such direct assertion is prohibited by the rules of conduct, the ego has a tendency to seek the same result, the slander of others. To portray others as evil is to glorify oneself by suggesting a comparison the ego would willingly develop, though it often restrains itself from doing so. The ego is activated by the principle of self-perpetuation and has a tendency to live and go by any and all means not close to it. If the ego faces curtailment in one direction, it seeks compensation, expansion in another. If it is overpowered by a flood of spiritual notions and actions, it even tends to fasten upon this very force, which was originally brought into play for the ousting of the ego. If a person attempts to cultivate humility in order to relieve himself of the monstrous weight of the ego and succeeds in doing so, the ego can, with surprising alacrity, transfer itself to this attribute of humility. It fits itself through repeated assertions like, I am spiritual, just as in the primary stages it achieved the same task by assertions like, I'm not interested in spirituality. Thus, arises what might be called the spiritual ego, or an ego that feels its separateness through the attainment of things considered to be good and highly spiritual. From the truly spiritual point of view, this type of ego is as binding as the primary and crude ego, which makes no such pretensions. In fact, in the more advanced stages of the path, the ego does not seek to maintain itself through open methods, but takes shelter in those very things that are pursued for the slimming down of the ego. These tactics of the ego are very much like guerrilla warfare and are the most difficult to counteract. The ousting of the ego from consciousness is necessarily an intricate process and cannot be achieved by exercising a constantly uniform approach. Since the nature of the ego is very complicated, An equally complicated treatment is needed to get rid of it. The ego has almost infinite possibilities for making its existence secure and creating self-delusion. The aspirant finds it impossible to cope with endless scoping up of fresh forms of the ego. He can hope to deal successfully with the deceptive tricks of the ego only through the help and grace of a perfect master. In most cases, it is only when the aspirant is driven to realize the futility for all his efforts that he approaches the master. By himself, he can make no headway toward the goal that he dimly sights and seeks. The stubborn persistence of the ego exasperates him, and in this clear perception of helplessness, he surrenders to the master as his last and only resort. The self-surrender amounts to an open admission that the aspirant now has given up all hope of tackling the problems of the ego by himself and that he relies solely upon the master. It is like saying, I'm unable to end the wretched existence of this ego. I therefore took to you to intervene and slay it. This step, however, turns out to be more fruitful than all other measures that might have been tried for the slimming down and subsequent annihilation of the ego. When through the grace of the master, the ignorance that constitutes the ego is dispelled, there is a dawn of truth, which is the goal of all creation. What a remarkable discourse. Where is all this humanity? When you look at all humanity, what they have been doing everywhere, such deep ignorance, so sad to look at all this. Total ignorance of the whole world, trying to settle the human problems by some sheer manipulation, making, dividing the lands between the people, making artificial peace, just only strengthening the problems of humanity. And the problem is we don't have a spiritual government to direct humanity along these lines. Who can direct it? Politicians. There's no one single person on earth who knows what is being said here. Nobody. Unfortunately, most of our dear community don't understand it. Because I can see all the time how people are getting involved with judgment. This is good, this is bad, this is good. So this is just say what it is being said. I'm the good guy, you're the bad guys. I know what is good, I know what is bad. I don't know what is good and bad. I have no idea after all these years. Living in the eye of the storm in the Middle East. Maybe I know a bit. Maybe I received from His Lordness a few keys to understand a little bit of what's going on. But these are conflicts going on for millions and millions of years. You know, all what we can do is to surrender to the perfect masters. Or at least to stop judging and stop feeling that this is good, this is bad. Keeps us all bound to this game of the ego. It's unfortunately hope more of our community or other spiritual people would listen to these discourses and read it and study. Read it dozens and dozens of times because I had to translate this book into Hebrew. So I had to read it many times, maybe 50 times, and it is never enough. Each time we read it again and again, keep on discovering something which you don't see before. The teachings of Meher Baba are so clear and within the level of our hearts, and they're also infinitely deep, to understanding of it. It's tragic how the darling community is not moving along these lines, as far as I can see. I can see all the time from my friends, my Facebook friends and others, I keep on judging, complaining the world. So That's what the ego is doing. Don't bring any remedy for the situation. Okay, everyone, thank you very much. Let's stop now the recording.